So, welcome everybody. My name is Chantal Cook, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'm also one of the directors of NALP. Joining me on this call, we also have our CEO, Jane Robson, former CEO and our patron, Amanda Hamilton, Nigel, who looks after all our marketing, and of course, our guest today, who is Tom Mortimer, who's the academic director at NALP, and he'll be answering our questions about what examiners are looking for. So welcome, Tom, and thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to leap straight in with a question. What are these pesky examiners? What are they looking for?
Thank you very much, Chantal. I think the first thing to say is that all examiners have previously been students, and therefore all of them are more than aware of the pain and suffering that many of you feel that you are going through when you're lumbered with these assignments that we require you to complete. So there is an empathy, and there is also a desire on the part of examiners to help you and to enable you to actually complete your qualification successfully. So that leads us to the question of how. How do you actually do that? What can you do to make sure that you enjoy success? And if I may, I'll answer this by looking at a number of different issues and examples. So I think the first thing that I would say to students, to learners, is that when you look at a question, it's very easy to see that question as a problem or a challenge. And my suggestion to you would be, don't look at it in that way. Try to look at the question as your friend, because what the question is doing is the question is giving you guidance. It's directing you to look at the topic or the area that the examiners want you to engage with. So it's very important to see the question and to grasp what the question is actually asking you about. Don't see it as something that you're fighting against. Now, if you can take that kind of approach to see it as a friend, I think linked to that, the next most important thing to say is that what the examiners are looking for is for you to be able to demonstrate your understanding of the topic. So the question that you may now be thinking about is how? How do I actually do that? How do I enable this examiner to be assured that I've got my head round this topic that I'm trying to answer a question on? And I think there are a number of things that you can do that will help the examiner to see your understanding and for you to demonstrate that understanding. The first thing is for your answer to be structured in a logical way. And this is where the question helps you, because very often when we ask questions, we will break those questions down into short paragraphs. And what we tend to do with law questions is we tend to treat each short paragraph as effectively being about a topic or an element within that area that you are looking at. So if you treat each paragraph as, if you like, an element or an aspect of the topic that you're being asked about, deal with the problem in that paragraph. So in order to deal with it, you need to look at two main things. You need to look at the fact So what factually are you being asked to talk about? And then when you've done that, you need to look at the law that is relevant to that factual scenario. So deal with the facts and the law in that paragraph, then move on to the next paragraph. Do the same again. Talk about the facts, talk about the law, then move on to the next paragraph. And that gives you a logical structure in your answer. And examiners love that because what it shows is that you understand a topic, that you're not jumping from one point to another point. You're addressing a point, you're dealing with it, you're reaching a semi-conclusion, and then you're moving on. So I think that's the first thing. Try and be structured and use the question in order to help you in your answer. The second thing that will enable you to demonstrate that understanding is your knowledge of the law. And what I think is really, really important and what examiners are looking for here is not for you simply to copy, for example, cases that you're given in your learning material or that you're given in a textbook. What the examiners want you to do with case law is they want you to use case law in order to be able to answer the question. And if I may, in a minute, I'll give you an example that kind of draws all of these points together. So the first thing is structure your answer logically. The second thing is demonstrate your knowledge of the relevant law through the appropriate use of cases. And we'll come back to that in a second. The third thing that you need to be able to demonstrate to show understanding is application of the law that you've discussed to the question that you have been asked. So it's really important when you use a case to explain to the examiner how and why that case is relevant to the fact you've been given in your question and how it enables you to be able to advise the person that you're trying to advise. And that leads us to the fourth point, which is that when you're answering these questions in that way, make sure that you answer all parts of the question. Very often, what we get as examiners is we will get a really, really good explanation of the facts or a really good explanation of the law. But those two things separately will not enable you to achieve a good mark. What you need to be able to do is you need to be able to bring those two things, the facts and the law, together and look at the way that they interrelate, look at the way that they link together, and then use those two things, facts and law, to reach your conclusion. So that if the question says to you, advise Fred, that's what you do. You advise Fred. So your final paragraph should be, given the facts and the law that we've considered above, my advice to Fred would be, A, B, and C. And that's where you relate everything that you have said back to the question that you have been asked. Now, if I might, I'm conscious that I'm talking a lot, but if I might just very quickly illustrate the way that we're trying to get you to use cases linked to this, I think that might be helpful, or I hope it will be. So, for example, let's imagine that we have a question that says something along the grounds of Amanda has lost her dog and she's put an advert in a local newspaper offering a reward of £100 for the safe return of her beloved dog, Fido. How would you deal with that question in light of what we've just said? Well, the point about it is that what you've got in that question is it's identified the area that the question wants you to talk about. So we know that the question is about offer and acceptance. And that helps us because it means we don't have to worry about consideration or terms or discharge or other areas of contract law. It helps us to focus on the relevant parts. And then what we would do is simply look at the facts and say, usually the law on offer and acceptance is that adverts are invitations to treat. So in other words, they're inviting people to make an offer. And the case that illustrates that, Fisher and Bell. So how could you use Fisher and Bell? So all you simply need to say is this was a case where a flick knife was put in a shop window with a price ticket, but the shopkeeper was subsequently charged with breaking the law, the Restriction of Offensive Weapons Act, by offering for sale an offensive weapon. And that is all the law from Fisher and Bell that you need to talk about. And then what you would say is that at the magistrate's court, Fisher, the shopkeeper, was found guilty. The shopkeeper appealed, and on appeal, he was discharged. He was acquitted. Why? Because he wasn't offering to sell the flick knife. He was making an invitation to treat. And what you would then do is you would then apply that law to the question that you've been given. And if that law is applicable, that would lead you to suggest that the person seeking the reward for the dog is not going to win. But then you would go on to say, exceptionally, the law allows adverts to be offers. And there you would talk about Carlyle and the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company. And briefly, you would just say that in that case, the court said it was an offer for various reasons. And you'd explain what those reasons are. And you would then apply those reasons to your question. And that would lead you to the conclusion that in this case, with Amanda and her dog, that Amanda is actually making an offer, and therefore the person finding her dog would be able to claim the reward. So what you can see, and then I am going to stop talking, but what you can see is that we've very, very succinctly talked about the facts of the case and the relevant law. We have not gone into great detail on it. And that is the way that you demonstrate to an examiner appropriate use of case law. Sorry, Chantal, that was a very long answer.
No, there's lots of really great stuff in there. So thank you. I get the feeling this is probably one of those that people are going to need to listen to a few times because actually, if you can
Yeah,
take all that in and understand it, you're going to pass that exam no problem really. So just to let you know that all the webinars do go into the members area. So if you're a member of NALP, then you can always access any of our webinars. It usually takes about a week roughly from the webinar being live, as is today's, to actually appearing in that section. But do go and have a look for our past webinars as well. Some webinars also go kind of live to everybody immediately. This one will be live on our YouTube channel at some point soon as well. And all webinars, again, once they've been in the members area, do go on to a kind of open area after about 3 months. So if you want to access our webinars, you need to be a member. If you're not currently a member for some reason, I can't imagine why, then do look out for those webinars that are available to you for free. And of course, anyone can join a webinar as we go live. So that's just to let you know, in case you've been listening to that and going, oh my God, there's some fantastic gems in there. I can't remember it all. Don't worry, you can listen again later. So I've got another question for you, Tom. You've obviously talked about how you need to cite the cases and how you say,
yeah.
I would use this and this would then enable me to give this advice or whatever. Do I have to remember all sorts of things like dates and weird stuff like that? Or is that not really that important?
It's not important. I mean, I think if you were doing this as an exam, and obviously with now we're not doing exams, if you were doing this as an exam, you certainly would not be expected to remember dates. Given that you're doing it as an assignment, then there is an argument that says, you've got the book, it doesn't hurt to include the date of the case. My view on it would be that there are some cases that are so well known that kind of the dates almost lodge in your memory. There are other cases where, with the best will in the world, you're not going to remember the date. So I really would not get too hung up about dates. The only time they really matter is where you get cases which are relatively recent, which have changed the law on a particular point. And then it is good sometimes to mention the date because it helps the reader to see the chronology of the development of the law and the cases. But really do not worry too much about dates.
Okay. And can examiners really spot AI?
100%. Examiners have tools that enable them to check whether or not learners have used AI inappropriately. We all know that AI is becoming more and more common in practice, and we all know that, it is not unusual now for common form letters to be developed and derived using AI tools. And that's absolutely fine. So nobody is saying don't use AI. What we're saying is use AI in an appropriate way. And an appropriate way does not include creating the answer for you. If you go back to what we started with today, the very first thing we said was that the way that you get good marks, the way that you do well in the exams is by showing your understanding. If you are using tools like AI inappropriately, that is not a demonstration of your understanding. It's a demonstration of something that is derived from another source, and that is not an appropriate thing to do. And linked to that is also plagiarism. Plagiarism is where learners use material but do not reference it appropriately and fully. And that is also something which examiners are very particular about. So avoid inappropriate use of AI, avoid plagiarism. Nobody is saying that you can't quote, and nobody is saying that you can't include examples, but you must put them in quote marks so that the examiner can see that it is not your words. And the other thing to say, finally, is that if you do quote things, those quotes are still part of the word limit. So again, it is important that you try and keep quotes to a minimum, but make sure if you do use them, that you quote them and use them appropriately.
I've got one last question until we hand over and ask everybody else's questions, but I can see some coming in the chat. But I've got one more quickly to ask you, very briefly. What's going to move me from a pass mark to a merit and then up to a distinction? What's the difference?
Right. I think the difference is that this is again where things like the way that learners use cases make a difference. So again, what we don't want to see is simply learners copying out what it says in the learning material for a case. What we want to see is what I was suggesting earlier on about succinct facts, succinct law, and then application to the question. So the more developed that skill becomes, and it is a skill, it's not something that you're going to be able to do immediately, but it is something that you can learn as you go through the various units working towards your ultimate qualification. So it's very much the sort of thing that becomes better with practice. So I think that's the first thing you can do, greater application. I think another thing that you can do is that if you link it back to what we were saying about the logical structure, because a logical structure gives the examiner confidence that you are able to demonstrate your understanding. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it flows. You're not jumping from one point to another point. I think another way in which you can move from that pass to a merit or even up to a distinction is to show a good understanding of the learning material. So if I could give you one bit of advice from today, it would be when you're learning stuff, when you're about to answer a question, take your time. Do not rush to try and complete it. Actually, have a go, leave it, come back to it, because that will enable you to look at it afresh. It will enable you to look at areas that you might want to develop and improve. So I think there are plenty of opportunities to be able to move up those mark grades and boundaries.
Lovely, thank you. Right, we've got just a very few minutes left. So I can see there's some questions. So I'm going to hand over to Nigel to ask those questions. And Tom, if you could answer them as briefly as possible, because we've basically got 3 minutes.
Rebecca wants to know how many cases they should be referring to in a 10-mark question.
I think going by numbers is a dangerous thing to do. I think it really depends on, you need to use the cases. So it's more about identifying one or two really, really important cases and using them appropriately. So, I mean, to specifically answer the question, which is a bit like, how long is a piece of string? But basically, you shouldn't really be using more than 2 or 3 in a 10-mark question.
Okay. And if the question doesn't specifically ask about case law, Jenny wants to know whether you should be using case law in their answer.
Yes, you should. If you think back to your days of learning about English legal system, you will know that law comes from two main sources, statute and case law. Therefore, you need to be able to show your knowledge of law, and that includes relevant statutes, if there are any, and case law, if there is any.
Okay. And following on from that, should they be using case law from just the case law that's used in the workbooks, or is it, if they're bringing in external cases, is that okay?
Well, I would positively encourage learners to bring in external cases. My only word of caution is make sure that it is English case law. We sometimes get students who will use Canadian cases or they will use American cases. And without being rude to Canada or America, generally speaking, those cases are not our first source of law. So, yes, by all means, but make sure it's English law.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for answering all those questions and so fully. There's loads of really, really useful information in there. And so just for me to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in a month's time. Thank you ever so much.